Okay, time to pay attention. Thad said I didn't need any introduction, so the heck with that. So anyway, today, Sharon Ashworth has been with K-State Research and Extension, Douglas County, since 2011. Sharon currently serves as the Horticulture and Natural Resource Agent. She has a BA in Environmental Studies, a Master's in Land Resources, and her Ph.D. in Ecology from the University of Kansas. Sharon is the author of Wading Right In, Discovering the Nature of Wetlands, published in 2019. To quote Sharon, working with Extension, I get to apply and interpret scientific information in order to help people create beautiful, sustainable landscapes. I can help you diagnose plant problems, recommend plants for your landscape, or advise you on caring for your rural acreage from ponds to prairies. Today, gardening to support insects. Native plants matter, but don't rip out the peonies. Please welcome Dr. Sharon Ashworth.
Thanks for being here, thank you, and I recognize, I see some familiar faces, so welcome, hi. So yes, that's what I'm talking about today, is native plants, basically, in terms of supporting our insects, but there is a caveat. There's a lot of interest these days in native plants. And there's been a lot of recent research on native plants and how they support insects. So I want to get you guys up to date on what the latest research has shown about native plants and cultivars and introduced species in terms of their support for natives in your garden. So how many of you actually already use native plants in your landscapes? Okay, good chunk. And what would you say is the main reason for doing that? Pollinators, is that how you started with that? Is you were interested in pollinators? And that began your interest in putting native plants, or were they just pretty sometimes?
They don't need to be watered.
They don't, okay. Water conservation is another reason. Those are all, yeah, water conservation, they are low maintenance, but as I'll point out there's no such thing as no maintenance. So what we're going to talk about today is definitions of what a native is. Let me start my timer here. We're going to emphasize integrating native plants. So I'm not here to tell you to rip out your landscape and put in natives. So we're talking about integrating native plants. And a few considerations about how to plant and maintain native plants. And then of course, I'll have some plant recommendations for everybody. And if this is being recorded, you can go back and look, because I might have to go a little fast through the recommendations. There we go. So let's start out with what is a native. So when you talk about native plants, you should always have a geographic qualifier to this. So a plant species is native to an ecoregion where it has evolved in concert with the soils, the weather, the insects. And so that's why it's really critical to have a geographic boundary of that, because you might say a plant is native to Kansas, but if it's native to western Kansas, it might not do so well in eastern Kansas. So having that geographic qualifier helps you, because there's lots of native plants to eastern United States, but if it's really mostly native to the southeastern United States, it might not do well in Kansas. So when you talk about natives, you try to get as specific as you can. But the thing is things are changing. The climate is changing. So there's a lot of interest now in trying plants, native plants that maybe come a little bit outside what is native here. And that's a whole nother topic in terms of assisted migration. When you plant plants that maybe are from a little further south than they were native, trying to assist in the migration of vegetation. So that's a very interesting topic to look into. But what we're going to do is we're going to focus, and most of the plants that I have recommendations are native to eastern Kansas and specifically to northeastern Kansas. Although we do borrow from Missouri, when I say native-ish, just because we have a lot of shade in town. And so a lot of those plants are coming from just over the border, because that's where more shade and more trees are. Because we're right here on an eco-tone, between the deciduous forest to the east and the prairie landscape to the west. So we're right there on the edge. So we use a little bit of both. So one way for you to determine whether a plant is native, these are two great resources. The Kansas Wildflowers and Grasses book by Mike Haddock. It's an online, and there's a hard copy version of the book. A great way to find out what's native to Kansas. And if there isn't something in that list, you can always go to the USDA plants database. And when you type in the scientific or common name of a plant, and then scroll down into it, it'll show you the whole United States, and then you just sort of scroll down into the county level data. And for most of the plants that you'll put in there, you'll see what part of Kansas it's native to, or if it's native to Kansas. So it's a really handy tool to use to see if something's native. And as I said, so there's a lot of benefits to planting natives. In terms of a landscape, they are adapted to local conditions, which means they'll handle the heat, they'll handle not being watered very well, they'll handle our soil, they'll handle our diseases and insects. But as I said, there's no such thing as no maintenance. I get calls all the time into the extension office saying, I want some flowers, some plants, I don't want to have to fuss with them, I don't want to take care of them. Well, you recommend native plants because they're low fuss, but everything needs to be watered that first year. You can't just plant it, stick it in the ground. And sometimes, when you're using native plants, like other even introduced plants, they can spread, they can be aggressive in a very cared for landscape. So you do have to keep on top of things. So there's no such thing as no maintenance. But people insist on finding what that is. And of course, I think they're beautiful. Well, there's some really beautiful native plants available. And this is a picture from the native medicinal garden that's just east of the airport, very next door north of the Waldorf School. So there's a research area with KU is in charge of that garden, but the master gardeners of Douglas County maintain the display garden. And so Margie can tell you all about that. The master gardeners have done a beautiful job of showcasing how native plants can be integrated into your landscape and look just as good as any introduced peony or boxwood or any of the other sort of typical things that you plant in a landscape. And of course, as you all mentioned, native plants support our native pollinators. And I always like to show this poster here, Backyard Bees of North America, because most people don't know how many native bees there are. I mean, usually we think of bumblebees, carpenter bees, or the honeybees. But this is just astounding, and I'm still always astounded when I see this picture. I was just taking kids through a soil trailer the other day on the fairgrounds, and I was there with teachers and kids, and it's the soil trailer. You walk in, and it's a sort of facsimile of what underground looks like, under the plants. And one of the models that's in this underground trailer is a bee. And people are like, bees live underground? And I said, yeah, our little native bees, they're solitary bees, and they make tunnels and they lay their eggs in the ground. And they're just like, but I had no idea that there were such things. And so it's a new concept for a lot of people to think that there are native bees that live underground. And that's where the larvae develop and then the adults fly out. And they're not, most of them don't sting. They're not aggressive bees at all. So what is a native var? How many of you heard of that term, native vars? Okay, just one. A native var is just a cultivar of a native plant. So people use that term interchangeably, native var or cultivar. People use the term native var just to say specifically, we took an echinacea, a coneflower, and we manipulated it to some extent, and they call it a native var. So in how you tell what's called a straight species, a wild type species, from a native var is if you look at the package here or the tag, if it's got a name, like in this one it says white swan, and up there I can't quite read it, but there's some common name, or there's an X, it'll say Echinacea X, and then it'll have some other name. those are keys to tell you that it is a cultivar, it's not a wild type species, because it's got some name in quotes. And, could be, Blue Rhapsody, it's always good, fun names on plants, and that's an indication that it is a cultivar. And here are, speaking of echinacea, some cultivars of our coneflower. So these are likely Echinacea purpurea cultivars. And so people have taken, breeders have taken a particular trait and manipulated it. So they changed the color, or they changed the shape, they changed the petals on it. And so this brings out, there's so many different varieties, and some of them are gorgeous. But the cautionary tale is depending on what trait that's being manipulated, it's either no difference to the pollinators or it makes a critical difference for the pollinators. For instance, this thing here with these double flowers, what they're doing, manipulating, is they're actually turning the reproductive organs of the flower into petals, which means there's no nectar in these flowers for pollinators. And that is an issue. So when you have double flowers, that's actually one of the traits that is not beneficial for the native insects. So here, and people manipulate all kinds of traits. So color, height, style and size of bloom, that's what I mean, the double flowers can be problematic, disease resistance. Now, one thing that people manipulate a lot, especially for home landscapes, is height. And it turns out that height really isn't changing enough of the wild type species to be problematic for insects. So that's a great one when you find varieties that are dwarf varieties of a native plant. That tends not to be problematic. The insects still use those plants. Some of the concerns with using cultivars are most of the plants, the cultivars that are developed are then just cloned. They're just bred, so there's hardly any genetic diversity in the population. So one of the things, when you have wild types, there's a lot of genetic diversity, but if you're gonna clone that one cultivar, it's the same genetic set, over and over and over again. So that is a concern. Another concern that people have is, does it change the nectar? Does it change the chemical nature of the nectar? Is there a change in the protein? Is there a change in the sugar quantity? Some nutrition, is there something else that's gonna change about that? And that's where a lot of the science is going, is to look into that, and it's just starting. It's just a very recent investigations into these sorts of changes. So, and I'll go through some of that. And another one that they have, that I've seen some studies where a lot of people like red or purplish leaves on a particular species, and that seems to make it less appetizing for the larval stages of insects. Changing that color changes the taste or the nutrition quality of that vegetation. So there is some evidence of that. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna focus on insect support, and does it make a difference to insects if it's native or introduced, or if it's native versus a cultivar. So we'll take a look at some of this. Oops. So yes, it does make a difference, but there's a lot of mixed results out there. So for interest, some of the latest research. So this particular publication that came out in 2022. So in this case, non-natives, so introduced species, performed very well, and they looked at specifically nectar volume, pollen quality, viability, protein content. Like I said, a lot of this research is brand new in terms of, a lot of the studies are just how many insects visit a plant. But now the research is going a little deeper and looking into some of the qualities of the pollen and the nectar. So in this particular case, it turns out the non-natives performed very well. Sometimes the natives did better, sometimes the non-natives did better. It's kind of a mixed bag of research. In this next study, Cultivars, they varied in this case stature, floral display, and foliage color. And in this case, they used milkweeds and looked at the larval stage, supporting the monarch caterpillar and native bees. And in this case, both the natives and the cultivars of the milkweeds did pretty much equally well for each, which is, I actually was kind of a little surprised by that one. But in this case, they did, but it was mostly, as you said, stature, floral display, and foliage color. What's unusual about this study is that most of the research that started out was one on bees, and specifically other pollinators, but they didn't, most studies, recent studies, have not looked at the larval stage, and that's where the key is when you're talking about native plants, you have to think about supporting the larval stage of the insects, not just that they're looking for nectar. The pollinators, you have to look at host specific, because that's where things get very specific, is when a plant supports is a host for a particular type of insect, and those are critical, and that does turn out to be critical. So looking at a couple other studies, natives versus cultivars, once again, it's kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes the insects preferred the natives, sometimes they preferred the non-natives. This is just looking at pollinators. Natives versus introduced. This was an interesting study because in terms of natives introduced, they did determine that natives were critical to support native pollinators, but found that by adding introduced species, whether it's your peonies, your roses, your zinnias, whatever, actually extended the resource, the nectar resource, on either end of the growing season. And so they were still important. You still needed those natives to support the native insects, but having non-natives in your landscape helps matters also because it extends that season. So here's a graphic that I really like that looked at this particular study, how urbanization, our urban environment in town affects what actually this sort of insect population that's supported in the city. And you can see if you can see here, we've got specialist species, generalist species, small and large bodied species, and once again, this is just looking at bees in this case, and ground and cavity nesting species. And when you put that through the filter of an urban environment, landscapes here in Lawrence, you find that what you lose in this case, going through in our urban environment, is we lose our specialist species, we lose our large-bodied species, we lose our early emerging species, and we lose our ground nesting species of bees. So that's what's filtered out by the landscapes that we typically plant in an urban environment. So by adding natives back into our urban environment, we can invite the things that have been X'd out here. So we can invite back in specialist species and large body species and ground nesting species by planting natives. Actually, with the ground nesting species, what's really helpful is you have patches of bare ground in your landscape. Don't put mulch over everything. Just leave some bare ground for those ground nesting species. So to give you some examples of specialist species, just focusing on the bees here, there is a blue sage bee specialist. That's where, it's a particular species is the Salvia azuri, our blue sage. And so if we don't have blue sage around, we don't have the blue sage bee. Another one, a coneflower bee, Echinacea pallida. I don't know if it's a specialist on just Echinacea pallida. It might be just coneflowers in general, that Echinacea. But that you won't have that bee if you don't have those Echinaceas there. So that's an example of a specialist. And then of the host relationships, the supporting, the plants that support the larval stages, here's a couple of examples. So if you see here, the adult food for the great spangled fritillary is a whole bunch of different sort of natives. But what's critical is the larval stage. It needs a violet in order to have a larval stage. So if you don't have violets, you're not going to support the population. this particular insect. And the same with the zebra swallowtail. You can see you can get nectar from all kinds of species. But you absolutely have to have the pawpaw if you're gonna support the caterpillar. So that's why these native species are critical for, native plant species are critical for our specialist native pollinators. And don't forget the grasses. I found this list at the University of Minnesota. I was just stunned by how many, in this case, moths, mostly skippers here, were supported by little bluestone. I mean, that's what they feed on. It was just amazing to me to think that that was critical. So don't forget about the grasses. It's not just the showy flowers that we need. So one of the most intriguing studies I came across was this one, City as a Refuge for Insect Pollinators, because it basically demonstrated that what we plant matters. So just as an individual homeowner, and what you plant in your garden actually can really make a difference on what sort of are in supporting our insect pollinators. I mean, we can make, sometimes you just feel overwhelmed. Like, what can I do as an individual? But in this case, this really is something that we can do as individuals to support the environment. By just planting and integrating a few natives into our landscape, we make a difference. It does matter, and this study showed it, that in these urban environments, if you can just plant a few things there and get, whole neighborhoods doing this, it really does make a difference. So I just find that exciting, because sometimes you feel a little overwhelmed in what you can do. So by integrating native plants, this is just a photo from my backyard, and I have my autumn joy, because there's so many bees on it, and I like to have that in there. But I have some liatris, I have some blue stem, rose verbena is a native, but my purple coneflower, some native are, Echinacea purpurea. So that's what I mean, just sort of mixing it up. The most important thing is to have something flowering all season. So there's some resource. And so these are often, like I say, if you go to a garden center or nursery, these are the types of natives you'll find readily available. So we've got bergamot or monarda, we've got milkweeds, there's 2 milkweeds here, we've got a phlox, a woodland phlox, we've got echinacea, we have black-eyed Susans, and that's a Culver's root down in the left corner there. And these symbols here, so that monarda, that little bee there, says, is an indication that that particular plant supports a specialist bee. And the little caterpillar is to show that that plant species supports the larval stage of a pollinator. So, as you can see in these commonly available natives, monarda, black-eyed Susan, and the Asclepias, the milkweed up there, just by putting those in your garden, support specialists and larval stages of pollination. These are commonly available. So you don't have to go to a specialty nursery. You don't have to do expensive mail orders or anything like that. These are around in all our nurseries and garden centers. And critical here for pollinators is variety. Lots and lots of variety. Have something blooming all from spring into fall. And different types of flowers, different shapes of flowers, different colors of flowers. The greatest variety that you can put in your landscape is going to be the most helpful, is to have just a variety. So variety of purpose, we've got, nectar and pollen plants, host plants, make sure you have some host plants for those larval stages, and what I call buffet plants. Those are the plants that support a lot of caterpillars so that the birds can eat. So the oak tree is the classic buffet plant. Oak trees support more caterpillars than any other plant species, tree species, and that's what feeds the birds, are all those caterpillars. And for our area, oaks are the critical species, that they're keystone species. And oftentimes I have to tell people this, is that if you're gonna plant for the insects, let them eat the plants and let them use the plants. because it is a little bit, it's hard when you plant your milkweeds and then they're just decimated by the caterpillars. It's hard to see that happen, but just think of it, that's what you planted it for. You planted it for the bugs, you planted it for the insects. So, you know, it's a different, you just have to not get too uptight about that and let them eat, let them use the plants. And it's just a different aesthetic, and just, you know, just try to feel happy that your plant is being used and not supporting the insects. But it is sometimes really hard to see the caterpillars munching away on your plants. Okay. So, a word about the neighbors. So, we were just talking, just before this presentation, we were talking a little bit about the weed ordinance in Lawrence, and which is going to be modified here in the next coming months. But it's a different aesthetic when you're planting a lot of natives. So that's why I sort of ease into this. By integrating plants, it's easier. It's easier on you, it's easier on the neighbors if you're starting to integrate native plants. If you're gonna do something that's a little more, a larger area, there are still ways to do that and not provoke the ire of neighbors who are not used to that aesthetic. I don't know how many of you went to the Theater Lawrence just had a recent play called Native Gardens. It was funny, we got a call at the office asking us to come do a presentation. So Susan Rendell did one and I did one. They actually had a play about neighbors feuding over planting native plants in the yard. It went beyond that. It had to do with class and privilege and everything. But the crux of the argument was on somebody planting native plants and somebody planting more traditional plants. And it was very well done, and it was just a lot of fun. But it's real. I mean, they have this, so that they have this whole play on it. Because people we're used to seeing all these green lawns. And if anybody wants to replace a lawn, I've got suggestions for you. But the key thing here is, I'm not a design person, but the key is focal points, edges, and signs. So once again, I'm gonna have pictures from the native medicinal garden that the master gardeners manage. And so here you can see, here's an edge. We've got some stones piled up here that sort of contain the native plants. And it gives neighbors, it gives a sense that somebody is maintaining this. Because we've all seen lawns where people have just stopped mowing, right? And nobody finds that really very attractive if somebody just stops mowing. But if you give it a focal point, you give it some sort of sense that somebody's watching, somebody's maintaining this. This is a deliberate planting. It really does help. So signage, of course, is very important. And a focal point, I've got like a bird bath up there, and here's another one from the medicinal garden with just one of these big rocks. It just takes the eye to that focal point and gives it the sense that this is maintained, this is designed, this is deliberate. And that helps a lot when you're trying to go plant more natives. So, plant recommendations. So, these initial plants, I'm not gonna name them all, I do have a list, are, these are the really low growing ones. So one of the things I try to do, and I actually get a call to the office a lot for this, is people are tired of mowing their lawn. They're tired of all the fertilizer and all the water, and they want to replace, but they don't want to go all native garden, especially if you're using taller plants. So one of the difficult things is to find shorter plants that can maybe substitute. So what I recommend is just shrinking the lawn a little bit, keeping areas for recreation. You know, if you've got, kids and pets, keep some of that lawn for recreation, but expand the garden beds. And then try shorter native plants to start out with. And so this is just a variety of short plants you can plant. You've got groundsel, and over here is wild ginger, and this is a little iris that only gets about, 6 inches, 8 inches tall. The purple poppy mallow is low growing. We've got Ruellia and verbena here, and these are all under a foot. So these are great ways to start out, sort of replacing a little bit of that lawn and expanding your gardens. So that's what these are. So here are my recommendations for under a foot, full sun to part shade, and that needs some moisture though. So they're not the real super drought tolerant natives. So pussy toes, wild ginger, the iris, wild strawberry is a great ground cover, but some of these you have to, like I'll point out this wild strawberry. It's a great ground cover, but it's a ground cover, meaning it's gonna get aggressive. So if you've got an area you wanna cover, that's great. But if you don't wanna keep pulling it out of your other garden beds, then you don't plant that. So it's really good to talk to, when you go to the nurseries and garden centers, to talk to the people there about what might be appropriate for your landscape. And Margie can tell you all about the native strawberry, right?
Oh, yeah. It'll take off.
Yeah, it'll take off, there's a lot of it. So if you've got ground to cover, that's a good one. And here are just some introduced ones that are typical, what you find. So you can either, add those in or replace some of these with the natives. So typically in this sort of environment, what you'll find is bugleweed, chamomile, creeping jenny. Those are the typical things in the landscape. But here are some native alternatives to add. And here are some others. Some of the same right there. This is actually an origeron, a little daisy-like thing, which is kind of fun to plant. I'm trying that one in my yard. And this is just what Pacra. I do a lot of ground recommendation around because we have so many trees in Lawrence, and this is just a fabulous little native that will grow in the shade, dry shade. And that's hardest to find. A native, something that will go in dry shade, and this is one of them.
What is it?
It's Pacra obovata. Groundsel is the common name.
Ground what?
Groundsel is Groundsel. And there are two kinds. There's Pacra obovata and Pacra aurea. And so one is technically native to Kansas, that's Pacra obovata. Pacra aurea is technically native more towards Missouri. But like I said, Pacra aurea is a little taller. So that's why I always talk about Pacra obovata. And it's just something to replace. So this is a mix of Pacra obovata and sedges. So, and it's a different, you don't have to worry about grass. People are always trying to grow grass under trees. And if you notice, it's usually bare under your trees. So I tell people you either gotta put mulch down, or you're gonna have to go with some other ground cover, because otherwise you just have to keep reseeding. Reseeding and watering, reseeding and watering, reseeding and watering, if you want grass to grow under trees. And people do call the office when they're finally tired of that. They don't wanna do that anymore, and this is one of the things I recommend. So native to native-ish. So in this case, this is a partial shade, so partial sun, under a foot and dry. These are the species that'll do that. Wild petunia, it actually is a larval host. Sedges are a great thing to plant. They're grass-like, and they're low-growing, and some spread, some don't. So the Pennsylvania sedge will spread, although I've been trying to get it to spread a little bit in my yard. It's really slow, I have to be honest. It's supposed to spread, but it's not really going for it, let's put it that way. But sedges are wonderfully, and they support all kinds of moths and skippers and other sorts of pollinators. There's a few more. There's a sedge up in the top left. We've got Ruellia, there's that strawberry. This is that Pennsylvania sedge, what it's supposed to look like. Well, it's taking a really long time. So another phlox. So these are all great, pretty little species to plant. And here's dry and sunny. As the more sun you get, the more plants you have to choose from. So there's a whole host of different plants that you can plant. These are still all under a foot, but will handle the drought once you establish them. Great things to look for. And there's some more pictures, pretty stuff. So here's some that you can just sort of tuck in here and there. Cardinal flower is a bright red flower. That's a beautiful one. I've got a button bush in my yard, so if you've got a larger space for a large shrub, button bush, that's going to support was it tiger's swallowtail? Button bush? I can't remember. Is that what's that called? I can't remember. So it's the larval host for something. Rosinweed is another good one. That stuff is almost indestructible, that rosinweed. Here are some other natives that are taller. You've got the purple coneflower. The little asterisk means they'll do well in central Kansas as well. Prairie coneflower. Yarrow is another almost indestructible one. That is a great beginner native plant. Supports lots of things, little flies, little bees, and it really is drought tolerant. I mean, you can hardly kill this stuff. This is great. And it doesn't spread. It doesn't get all over the place. More pretty plants to plant. And in this case, we've got some specialist bees and some larval supporting the hosts. More plants. So there's just a whole variety. And golden Alexander's is fabulous, but it will spread. It gets a little aggressive if it's in cared for areas. And I put these out here as recommendations, but I always, especially because there's a few master gardeners in here, to talk to the master gardeners and talk to other gardeners, because people have opinions about all of these. So everybody has their favorite and plants they don't like, and if you talk, you'll get a different set of plants for every master gardener you talk to. And these two are great, New England asters and prairie ironweed. But here are some shrubs that one of the master gardeners, Susan Rendell, has done a lot of planting. So when I mentioned cultivars, so these are all dwarf varieties of typical native shrubs. And this is something and it's still going to support the pollinators. The only thing that's changed about these plants is they've made them dwarf, which is much more manageable in our landscapes here in town. So aromatic sumac, they have something called a low grow. That's actually, I've planted a lot of that. It's really nice. The dogwood, there's the buttonbush, and line bark. And so they'll only get about 3 or 4 feet tall, as opposed to 9 or 10 feet tall. So these are excellent, excellent landscape plants. And resources. So we have a publication at the Extension called Plant Native Kansas. Everything from crop strips, pollinator strips for crops, to prairies. Includes gardening and landscaping with native plants. And here's a fun thing. One of the K-State researchers put together this bee machine. It's an app you can put on your phone, and you can learn all the different native bees. You remember that poster I showed you? There's so many native bees out there. And all you have to do is take a picture using this bee machine, and it'll tell you what the species of bee is. And then it goes to a database. It's a citizen science project. And so they're tracking the presence of all these bees across Kansas. And actually, I think it's beyond Kansas too. It's a great, fun little app because you get to learn. I'm trying to learn more and more about the native bees. And it's a lot of fun to use. So I highly recommend the bee machine, K-State. And here's some more regional resources. We've got the Kansas Wildflowers and Grasses that I mentioned. Dick Arboretum, if you go to their website, fabulous recommendations for drought-tolerant plants. Missouri Botanical Garden, great source. Grow Native is one of these websites they're just over in Missouri. You type in your zip code, and it'll give you a list of native plants to plant. You can do that with National Wildlife Federation. Jayhawk Audubon has Plants for Birds. Lynn Bazinski here knows a lot about that one.
Well, actually Lawrence Bird Alliance now.
Oh, that's right.
Changed their
That's
website
right.
too.
Yeah,
So
Lawrence
it's
Bird Alliance.
lawrencebirdalliance.org.
And
But
they,
we link to the National Audubon site where you type in your zip code and it gives you a list.
but you also have a list specifically for Northeast Kansas.
Right.
On the website.
Yeah.
So it's a great resource. Kansas Native Plant Society, fabulous website with lots of recommendations for native plants. And then various extension offices have their own lists of plants. So there's tons of resources out there now because it's becoming more and more popular to do this. Like I said, lower maintenance, you're helping the pollinators, and what you plant really makes a difference. So, planting native pollinators, you're gonna support your native pollinators and local food web. It reduces garden maintenance and costs. There's another study I found that actually they followed 10 years of lawn maintenance versus planting a native landscape, and it turns out it's cheaper to plant a native landscape than maintain a lawn. And then they're just beautiful, beautiful sustainable gardens. Go see the native medicinal garden that the master gardeners manage. And there, now I have some time for questions. So, if anybody has any questions. Yes?
How important are dandelions in the spring?
Oh, well, the thing about the dandelions and henbit, that little purple plant that gets everywhere, is they are some of the first nectar resources available for pollinators. So one thing you might be able to do if it's really hard for you to let dandelions grow in your yard, is just once they become that little puff ball, go ahead and remove them so they don't spread everywhere. But you know, they're the first thing almost that's available for pollinators. Now they are an introduced species, they're not native, but so maybe just get rid of them later. Just let them grow for a little bit and then get rid of them
Don't wait till
later.
May.
But don't wait till May,
Don't
right?
wait till May.
Yeah, don't wait till May if you don't want them to spread. Another thing, you know, people do, when speaking of dandelions and weeds in the lawn, I want to say something about No Mow May. That became a really popular thing. No Mow May, No Mow May. It's really easy to say and really think about. That doesn't work here in Kansas. That was a program that came from Wisconsin. They have different seasons there. So waiting to May to mow doesn't really work in Kansas. The other thing is, then the next thing was, well, maybe, what was the other races? No mow till April, or I forget what the other phrase was. But the thing is when you stop mowing and you're letting your lawn grow, what you're really doing is just allowing the introduced species, the tall fescues, and various other weeds to grow up tall. You know, yes, it's a little bit better for pollinator resources, but you're better off planting natives, integrating natives into your landscape than stopping mowing. You're gonna help more pollinators by planting natives than you are by stopping mowing. And you'll aggravate the neighbors less.
And they like.
So you're better off integrating natives than not mowing. So, yes.
I've seen some on different shows or videos that people are doing like a grass clover mix. Is that a good thing to do around here, or?
Yes, that is a good thing. I mean, it used to be that clover was just a standard part of
My
lawns.
first yard
but-
was mostly clover anyway. so-
Well, but here's the thing about, you don't want just a clover
Right.
logger. Because I've seen examples around town, people get a little excited about it, they plant only clover. Clover will not handle our drought and heat, and so the whole thing just dies. So what's best to do is integrate clover into, so if you wanna keep a lawn, a fescue lawn, is to introduce clover. So if you mow it really low in the spring and then put some clover seed down, you can start to integrate clover into it. So a mix of fescue and clover is best. Because then you'll at least have something there when the heat comes on. Also, people have asked about that microclover. There's a microclover that was developed in Maryland, and it works there. But there's not enough moisture here for the microclover. Although the K-State is now doing test plots finally of the microclover because they've had so many calls about it. So they are doing some testing. You know, another thing to do with lawns is if you've got a very sunny spot, you can try zoysia, which isn't native, but it's drought tolerant, and buffalo grass, the native grass. So.
Another thing with our yard, we have fences on the west side and the east side. So the west side has shade from like noon on, and there's bare patches there because of leaves over the years and such. And then the east side fence, you know, basically has sun all day. So there you've got a wide variety of what you can't do or such. And if we wanted to fill in along that fence, do we, you know, put shade stuff on the west side and sunny on the east and see
Yeah.
what happens?
And that's actually a fabulous opportunity for diversity. I mean, think about all the different plants you could have. On the one fence, the sunny things, and on the other fence, the things that will tolerate part shade. And now, just by planting those different tolerances, the plants of those different tolerances, you've got an incredible diversity in your yard. And that's the best thing for the insects, is to have all that diversity. So that's actually a fabulous problem to have. So,
One of the resources that I look at a lot are the results of pollinator visits that are published on the Mount Cuba website.
Yes.
That's in the Brandywine Valley, which is like the best horticultural place in North America to grow flowers. But having said that, I think a lot of it does translate here because they are doing a lot of work with native species. But one of the things that I haven't seen there, and I wonder if maybe you've come across it, is whether all the different wonderful colors of yarrow are as beneficial as the native white yarrow.
I have not seen a study on that because there are so many different colors.
There are.
And yeah, no, I haven't seen a study. I wonder, because what they do at Mount Cuba, which is great, is they'll take a genus, and so they just came out, I looked at the website just the other day, and they've done a study on ironweeds, all these different species of ironweeds. And then they look at it for pollinator support, but also some typical horticultural things. How big does it get? How many flowers does it have? Things like that. So we'll take a genus and do some species, but I haven't seen one on yarrow. That would be a great one.
That'd be a good one.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you work with the Kansas State Extension Center at the
Yes, I am the horticulture agent for Douglas County.
Douglas County?
Mhm.
You mentioned Maryland, so in Mount Airy, they have a purple martin refuge. And purple martins my dad used to have a purple martin hotel.
Oh, fun.
And so they eat insects, they eat mosquitoes. And the purple martins disappeared and they were taken over by starlings.
Oh, the hotel, yeah, the hotel's been invaded by starlings.
And you mentioned yarrow.
Mhm.
I think that, so we lived in Maryland, I've also lived in New Mexico. And I'm a bird watcher. I just happened to bring this, but our wetlands have attracted orioles.
Mhm.
And we didn't really have orioles before.
Well, I would defer to Lynn, more about the birds. I know a little bit about birds, but, Lynn's our birder here. So,
I don't actually know the historic progression of the oriole, so I can't really speak to how long they've been around, but boy, they're abundant now. And we are seeing, purple martins out of the Baker wetlands.
Yeah, the Baker wetlands have attracted, that's where I've seen the orioles.
Right,
And so Maryland has quite a few different
Yeah, you
species
see
of
both orchard and Baltimore orioles here.
I don't know exactly.
Orchards were yellow.
Yeah, they're
yeah.
bright yellow.
And speaking of birds, I mean, one of the things that a lot of the initial studies about native plants focus just on pollinators. But realizing that I mean, we really need larval hosts, because that's what's supporting the birds. You gotta have a lot of caterpillars. What is that from Talame's study? It takes a chickadee,
It's like 73,000 caterpillars. It's some phenomenal number
Yeah.
of caterpillars
Yeah.
that a nest of chickadees eats or is fed
it's just
before
incredible.
they fledge. It
Yeah.
is incredible.
Yeah, so for our part of the country, that's why I mentioned oaks. They support the most caterpillars, and so you need a lot of oaks or a lot of caterpillars to support the birds. But there are a lot of other plants, they're starting to, I've seen one study, again from Talame, Doug Talame, on native shrubs and how many more caterpillars those shrubs support than introduce. You know, boxwood just isn't gonna do it. There's nothing that lives on that except for mites. I find so. Yeah, it stays green, it has a purpose. So you're trying to cover something.
Yeah.
All year round, that works.
Can you tell us a good place to purchase native plants?
Yes, there's the really common ones, just about any garden center in town is gonna, have echinacеas and some milkweeds and things like that. So you can get the real common ones just about anywhere. If you wanna get the more rare, harder to find, one of the nurseries that carries a lot of native plants is Finland Valley. That they carry a lot of plants, and then there's Happy Apples Farm in Tonganoxie. They carry a lot of native plants as well. But Henry's and Clinton Parkway, and Pebbles, they all carry some. But those two sell a lot of native plants, Finland Valley and Tonganoxie, and then there's mail order. But when you're doing mail order for plants, so there's a very popular native nursery called Prairie Moon Nursery. A lot of information, great information on that website. But that Prairie Moon Nursery is far north of here.
It's Wisconsin.
Was it Wisconsin? Yeah. And so if you can at all possible, try to buy within the region that you live, because those plants, the seed collection and the propagation of those plants is happening in our climate. So you can get a lot of native seed. There is actually, there's Fay Farms, there's Star Seed, there's another big seed provider that actually produce here in Kansas, or at least in the same latitude where we are. So try to stick regionally, if at all possible.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, when you buy seeds for native plants, is it a problem like it is for other plants, that the seeds are sometimes coated with pesticides and things like this? With seeds being coated for, anti-bugs, basically.
Right, I haven't heard that there's any problem in terms of once that germinates, except for neonicotinoids,
Right.
the systemic pesticides. But in terms of just the coating, no, I haven't come across any concerns about that. The other thing about, about pesticides, I was thinking I was having a conversation with somebody last night, is usually a lot of those seed mixes come with some sort of mycorrhizal fungi to add. And a lot of that is marketing gimmick, these commercial things, but there is some more work being done. And so I think we'll see better mixes coming out that might actually really help with the germination of native seed. But be cautious of some of those things.
Would you name